Welcome back to Just Liberty, where liberty and justice meet. I'm Alan Reinach, president of the Church State Council, and I'm here with my co host, Bettina Krause, editor of Liberty Magazine, the best magazine devoted to religious freedom in the world, and also the oldest, going back almost 120 years next year. And we are trying, desperately at times, it seems, to take liberty back from the political extremes. Now, today's topic is one that a lot of people are talking about. We now have an American Pope. Imagine that. A guy who loves baseball and hot dogs, maybe not the beer, I don't know about that, but in the Vatican. So let's get right to it.
We are delighted to have with us today Professor Darryl Hart, who is a renowned author and historian of American religion. He's a professor at Hillsdale College in Michigan, and he's written more than a dozen books covering topics from Calvinism to Billy Graham to separation of church and state. And the first book of his I encountered was American Catholic, The Politics of Faith During the Cold War. I can highly recommend that. His most recent book, I believe, is from Oxford University Press, Benjamin Franklin, Cultural Protestant, and that's another one I'm looking forward to reading. So thank you for joining us today, Professor Hart. Darryl?
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Now, you wrote a cover article for Liberty Magazine. It's in a current issue of our magazine, and it's a history of Catholicism in America, which is fascinating given recent developments on the world stage. Can you give us, first of all, an understanding of how American American Catholicism is of a sort of a unique flavor, I guess? What distinguishes it from other variety?
Sure. I should start with a disclaimer that because I'm not Roman Catholic, I tread somewhat fearfully on this subject. Not because, there's just a long history of Protestant Roman Catholic disagreements, and typically Protestants haven't waded into these waters. But I think the easiest way to answer that, simplest way, but I also think accurate, is that it's an immigrant church. Of course, all Christians in the United States are immigrants, typically. The churches that are here usually came from Europe or Britain, same in some ways. But the Roman Catholic Church began as a communion of immigrants, especially in the mid 19th century, with especially the Irish, Germans as well. But then later in the 19th century, with a lot of Italians and Polish and other parts of Europe began to come during that big period of immigration to the United States. And those were the formative years of Roman Catholicism. The priests and bishops themselves may not have been immigrants, or at least from immigrant backgrounds. Some of them would have been European. Many priests would have been Irish, trained perhaps on the continent of Europe. But the rank and file in the churches were immigrants, and they wound up, especially the late 19th century, but even in the middle of the 19th century, places like Boston forming neighborhoods, sometimes known as ghettos, where the church, the parish, was the center of community life, of Roman Catholic life, and that is a very different flavor, I think, of Christian experience, even for Protestants who would have been ethnic at times, ethnic in background, coming from Michigan, where I live now, the western part of the state especially. There was a large Dutch Protestant or Dutch Calvinist group that settled there, and that was in some ways a kind of regional ghetto, but it wasn't as urban as what the Roman Catholics, Catholic immigrants experienced on the East Coast, but also Chicago, and other Midwestern cities. So I think that is that's a big part of it. And then when you do get to the 20th century, I don't want to get ahead of myself with your questions, but when Roman Catholics become suburbanized, which happens especially after World War II, I think the church is still sort of figuring out how to adjust between its past here in the United States as an immigrant church and now as a fairly affluent, well, sometimes very affluent suburban sort of church.
So, Professor, one of the things that's I think hard for Americans today to kind of process into our understanding of American Catholic experience is the extent to which those first generations faced quite significant opposition, discrimination, hostility. And I guess part of my question is how much of that was kind of traditional Protestant attitudes about Catholicism as a religion? How much of it was ethnic, discrimination against Irish, Polish, Italians as somehow less white or lesser than Germans, British, French, etc.
Right. And that's a very good question. Oftentimes when people say that to a question, that means they don't know the answer. But I think I do know part of the answer to that. But it is a very important question because in the colonial British America experience, Maryland stands out as a colony that was founded as a place for Roman Catholics from England to go, and Maryland has some of the earliest laws of toleration. Maybe not necessarily charitable. They needed settlers. They wanted to get as many people to come as possible, and that meant trying to draw Protestants from England and Scotland there. And eventually that kind of blew up, partly because Protestants really didn't still care for Roman Catholics, but it is the Maryland backdrop is the most Roman Catholic spot in colonial America, and it produces the Carroll family, very notable, learned, the first bishop of the United States comes from that family. So he's English in background. Of course, the English Roman Catholics didn't fit in Britain, but still there was a kind of a sense that the English or British were moving on that. By the time of 1829, you have the emancipation of Roman Catholics in Britain. So I think Protestants in colonial America could play nicely generally with the English Roman Catholics, but what the Irish come, that's a different kettle of fish in particular. And I do teach a little bit on modern Irish history, and the Irish are trying to gain independence, not unlike the American colonists as well, and it just doesn't go as well. And the Irish carry a lot more grievances and resentments than the American patriots might have had because they in Ireland they are the majority population by about 80%, and the Protestants, whether Anglican or Presbyterian, are only about 20%. And it's the Anglicans who are running things in Ireland. So there's a different set of dynamics. And since some of the settlers in America are Ulster or Scots Irish, they also have a certain perception of Irish Roman Catholics that's not very kind.
It's interesting because you're describing this experience of American Catholics as being outsiders in the early decades of the American Republic, but it wasn't just one way because American Catholics also, it seems, were looked at somewhat suspiciously, maybe by the Vatican. Correct, in terms of how they expressed their Catholic identity within the American Republic. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How did these American Catholics, how were they viewed through the eyes of those in the Vatican?
Right. Um, and that's another fascinating part of this. And it's hard for people today to go back and imagine that the Vatican in some ways didn't care about America. But there were no reasons why the Vatican in the 19th century needed to care about the United States, Roman Catholic or not, because the United States was just not a world player the way it became, especially in the 19th century, 20th century, excuse me. Um, but as an immigrant church in a society that's largely Protestant, Rome had a lot more to worry about than America. They had a lot more to worry about, specifically in the case of France and the French Revolution and the anti-clericalism that came out of that. And that does in some ways affect European Roman Catholics' view of America, because America is also a republic. France is a republic. Republics are revolutionary. They upset the political order. So, America may be similar to France, but America is a very different sort of revolutionary experiment than France was, and I think you could say much more stable. Um, so the priests, the bishops who come to America find America to be a generally congenial place, minus some friction that breaks out here and there with rioting once in a while in places like Philadelphia and Boston, 1830s, 1840s. But so you may have been leading to the point that the current pope, I'm not to get way ahead of ourselves, but the current pope is named Leo the 14th. And Leo the 13th, his predecessor of that name, issued an encyclical, 1899, Testem Benevolentiae, which condemns Americanism as a heresy. And simply put, as a bumper sticker definition, Americanism was a way of trying to adapt Roman Catholicism to the American environment. And generally, there are better and worse ways of doing it, and Leo the 13th recognized the better and worse ways, I think, generally, but he was trying to also keep the European bishops in some measure of consensus, and they were still very fearful because of the French Revolution, and they didn't want the American church to get out over its skis, as it were, and channel too much of that revolutionary, Republican, radical sentiment.
Well, it strikes me that central to what was wrong with Americanism from the Vatican standpoint is our First Amendment's provision for a separation between church and state, because that ran counter to, you know, more than 1,000 years of European history where, uh, Catholicism had a very close relationship and significant influence on not just the Holy Roman Empire as such, but, on the state. And that was the model that the Vatican knew, understood, believed in. Our model of separating church and state was perceived as very hostile, wasn't it?
Yes, and I mean, to even be more specific, excuse me, to pick up on the First Amendment, but also to step on the toes of Protestants, especially the ones who are responsible for Massachusetts, from where I'm speaking. But there is a phrase that Roman Catholics are debating 1950s and 1960s leading up to Vatican II, the phrase being "error has no rights." Um, and they eventually sort of clear ground to make the provision that our First Amendment does make, which is that by virtue of freedom of religion, freedom of expression, we guarantee people the right to be in error, and we have to sort of tolerate error. The Roman Catholics didn't really do that officially up until Vatican II, the 1960s. But it's also the case, and I try to point this out to students, the Puritans of Boston, who I admire greatly for many reasons, very notable, courageous figures, but they had a similar view that error has no rights for most of their history. So it's not simply a Roman Catholic view, it's also a Protestant view. But what happens, I think, with the American founding is that you have different kinds of Protestants, Anglican, Presbyterian, Baptist, Quaker, Lutheran, all sort of figuring out they can live together. So you people have errors, but we know those kind of errors. They're okay. But there is a general kind of breakthrough with the Protestant denominationalism of the founding that allows at least Protestants to have errors and to live with those, which then begins to turn in the direction of greater more room for more errors. And of course, we may be at a point in our history where we have too much room for too many. But anyway, that's another question.
Well,
So
I'm tempted to drill down on that, Bettina, because
go.
it strikes me that it was uniquely Calvinist um, theological roots that had that kind of intolerant, my way or the highway, approach far more so than others. But as far as the sort of truce based on the denominationalism, which was largely a product of the First Great Awakening, uh, I certainly I certainly agree. We have also the strain from uh, the Radical Reformation, and I think looking at the experience of the Anabaptists, it seems almost obvious that if you're being drowned because of your belief rejecting infant baptism, that you reason that the state really has no authority to be a theological arbiter as between one belief about baptism and another, and you come to an understanding that religion can't be subject to the jurisdiction of the state.
Right. And I think you're right. I mean, the Anabaptists learned early on the problems of religious establishments or even Constantinianism, going back to the kind of melding of bishops and emperor back at the time, the fourth century. And it took Protestants longer to get there. And I think you're right also, even though I myself am from the Calvinist persuasion of things, I do think, at least in the Anglophone world, in British and United States, Canadian, Australian, New Zealander history, even probably South Africa as well, that it's the Reformed and Presbyterians, the so-called Calvinists, that were really kind of prickly and zealous and strict about these things, and sort of holding on, at least trying to hold on to religious establishments, or actually erect them and maintain them, that led to difficulties. Although I wish I knew more about the Lutheran establishments in different places and how that played out. I know the Anglicans were also at times not the most charitable with Presbyterians in England and Scotland when they had power. But anyway, it's still a worthwhile point that the Puritans represent that line of Calvinistic strictness.
So I want to turn now to this pivotal moment, Vatican II. We have, you mentioned in your article, prior to Vatican II, there were various attempts by some Catholic thinkers in America to kind of reconcile traditional Catholic theology and identity with American republicanism. A Jesuit priest, I think John Courtney Murray. Um, but then we have Vatican II. Can you take us sort of through the years leading up to that? What was happening within American Catholicism in the decades leading up to Vatican II, and then how did that change the church in America?
Well, that would be the period when, especially after World War II, and it must be said that Roman Catholic Americans, fought in higher proportions than other American citizens in both World War I and World War II. So even though there may have been uh, some criticism of Americanism by the Vatican, rank and file um, Roman Catholics and priests were very patriotic and still very much committed to sort of the nation's ideals and its military prowess. But after World War II, that's when the church is beginning. I mean, on the ground demographically, beginning to suburbanize. It means there are more Roman Catholics going to university and college. The Roman Catholic universities really begin to flourish during that period as well. Um, and there's also a backlash among American Protestants, or the mainline Protestants, and fears of anti-Catholicism. I mean, fears of Catholicism. So there's a breakout of anti-Catholicism. Paul Blanchard writes a best-selling book called Catholic Power and American Freedom, something like that, but very much worried, making standard anti-Catholic arguments at the time. That's where John Courtney Murray this Jesuit priest and theologian, emerges as a defender of Roman Catholics, even though the Vatican says he's gone too far and asks him not to write about church and state because he's beginning to entertain the idea that it's okay for a government to tolerate error. So that's all in the air. Then you have, I guess it's John the 23rd, who becomes Pope in 1958. And he is a roly-poly of a man, and he's not like incredibly well educated. He's pretty old. His health maybe isn't great, and people sort of put him there thinking he's not going to last that long, but he's kind of a placeholder. And all of a sudden, he calls for the Second Vatican Council, um, sort of out of the blue. And this coincides, not directly, but it happens. I think it's more than coincidental that John F. Kennedy is elected president of the United States, first Roman Catholic elected. It's not the second one to run for office on one of the major parties. The first was Al. Why am I forgetting his last name? The governor of New York from 1928, who ran very unsuccessfully. But Kennedy wins. And this is a time, too, when the United States really has emerged as the leader of the free world. For good or ill, there would be debates among Americans about that position, but the United States is really responsible for sort of keeping the world safe from communism for democracy. And Kennedy is very much a champion of that as well. And so I don't think it's merely accidental that the Vatican II thinks, wait, maybe the world has changed in some ways. Maybe we need, in some ways, to update the church. Now, that word update may be a little too aggressive for some traditionalist Roman Catholics, but I do think you can look at all of the canons and decrees of Second Vatican Council and see ways in which the church modernizes at that point. It tries to make itself modern friendly, much more accessible to the modern world, even opening itself up to the modern world. That is sometimes the language of Vatican II, which is really quite surprising because the 1960s, if you were going to open yourself up to the modern world, I would not have chosen the 1960s. I might have chosen the 1950s, maybe even the 1930s. Well, I don't know. But there might have been a better time to start talking with the modern world than that. So and that does lead to a great crisis, I think, not only for Roman Catholics, other Protestants experience this as well, but still, how do you relate to the modern world when you have a sexual revolution going on, when you have women's liberation going on, when you have these protests about the Vietnam War and the prosecution of the Cold War going on? It's a very turbulent time. Um, and so it's a really kind of odd moment where Roman Catholicism, which has this huge history, these deep roots in even the ancient world, seemingly, et cetera, these institutions of great power and grandeur, and then all of a sudden to open yourself up to the modern world, and the modern world is going crazy. It's a really odd set of developments, and I still think the Roman Catholic Church is catching up. I think John Paul II comes along as Pope, I believe, starting in 1978, tries to start calming things down, and I do think he had a long papacy to do that as well, which helped. But there's still very much a lot of debate in Roman Catholic circles about how conservative he was, how repressive he was, or whatever, how much he was in step with Vatican II or not. Um, so those debates still go on.
So just let me jump in here. How did this idea of church and state transform or develop in the years after the Second Vatican Council? What impact did it have on that?
I guess the formal issue is the church recognizes religious freedom. It does so explicitly. And it in effect, leaves it up to different states, even if it's a Roman Catholic majority society, how they're going to do that. And since I do teach on Ireland, Ireland was a Roman Catholic state. It's even in the Constitution from 1937. And Quebec, the province of Canada, is a very Roman Catholic place. And there would have been laws that would have at least promoted the church is there. And what's remarkable in those two settings is how quickly those societies secularized, in some ways, much more dramatically than Protestant dominated societies did. So, is it, I haven't seen anybody work out why it is the case that when Roman Catholic societies embrace religious freedom, they secularize much more rapidly. But that did happen. But it is still the case, excuse me, that in the United States, for instance, the bishops, the council, sorry, conference of bishops, they don't like the word council, um, has written letters, has made all sorts of statements about public life. So it's still the case that the church, the bishops have a standing in American society and have a voice with Roman Catholics, but also with executives and legislatures. And we have a system that allows for that kind of religious freedom. There are some groups that obviously think anytime churches speak out on religious issues, that's somehow a violation of church and state. But it's, I guess you could say, after Vatican II, the Roman Catholic Church officially sort of catches up to where the Protestants were, even though they probably wouldn't like me putting it that way.
Oh my head is spinning. So many different angles here. But going back to um kind of why Vatican II happened when it did and the accommodation with um religious liberty, with kind of modernism, as you say, it strikes me that, I mean, churches generally are, a generation behind modern times. We're pretty slow to adapt, but I mean, I do see it as Catholicism kind of recognizing the realities of the modern world and trying to um, uh, update or adapt in a way that will maintain its relevance. And does does that sound remotely uh, on point?
No, I think that's true. But I think the dilemma and where you see it play out, and particularly in particular with the great challenge, is in the realm of liturgy and worship, where um, part of the appeal of Rome and at Hillsdale College we have some, probably a dozen students every year convert to Roman Catholicism, and part of what the appeal is its medieval background. And we have a lot of students who major in the classics, so they're taking Latin, and the Latin Mass becomes something that's really pretty important. It represents heritage. I guess it's a beautiful language. I mean, when I've read it and studied it, it seemed okay. I mean, I still think French and Portuguese sound prettier than Latin, but um, so, but after Vatican II, there were changes in worship, opening up worship into the vernacular so that they weren't using Latin Mass. And that's been a contested point of the different popes since Vatican II. John Paul allowing for the bringing back the Latin Mass, Latin Rite, and Benedict as well. And then Francis restraining that. And it's not clear what the current Pope Leo XIV will do with that. But you could find videos of the mass with the polka mass or different kinds of vernacular masses with really bad music and really bad affect, that is trying to be relevant. Protestants were trying to be relevant with worship long before this, and in my own estimation, aesthetically, it didn't always work out real well, and Roman Catholics have a period of doing that. But even beyond that, say, with parochial schooling and who staff the parochial schooling, the number of nuns just plummets after the 1960s. And so you have conceivably free labor at some of these parochial schools in urban settings that all of a sudden just lose their workforce and they have to start hiring teachers. But it's also the case that families may be thinking, well, why is a Roman Catholic education as necessary as it used to be if we're opening ourselves up to the modern world? So there are all sorts of ways in which that openness can play out, especially when you've sort of operated as an ethnic ghetto with your own parishes, your own sense of identity that you're different from the rest of the American Protestants. And now all of a sudden you're beginning to think, well, no, we're supposed to be open to that in a way. And plus, you're making more money so that you can actually buy a house in the suburbs and go to a public school and go to a contemporary parish out there in the suburbs that don't look like one of the cathedrals, but look like some kind of maybe even like a theater or something.
All that we've been talking about has been leading to, I think, a question that many of our listeners will be interested in, which is how does all of this history inform how we should think about the new pope, the pope that was recently elected? For a start, were you surprised to see an American pope elected?
Yes. But I mean, I'm not I do follow Roman Catholic news fair amount. But I wasn't deep into the weeds of who were the inside favorites. Although I still some of the articles I did read, I don't think the current Robert Prevost, I think is his name, was on the list. Um, so yes, and just personally, since I know Chicagoland a little bit, and he comes from Chicago. I know the American baseball, professional baseballs, and I know the White Sox. I've been to White Sox games, and he's a White Sox fan. All of a sudden, the Pope was so much more relatable to me as an American, even though I'm a Protestant. And it writing this article for you actually gave me all sorts of optimism just about having like kind of a friendly face in the Vatican, somebody who might know my background in a way, w in a way that I've never thought about other popes who have been in that office. Um, but I still think it's really hard to tell where he may be going with the kind of powers that he does wield, and part of the powers he wields as well is within the Vatican structures itself, with all the agencies in Vatican City and the different cardinals who report to him, etcetera. It's a huge operation, and I don't know how anybody can run all that, and, I mean, he knows how it works having been in the Vatican prior to this. Um, and so far, I can't get a read on how the American church is even reading, Leo 14th. I mean, I think a lot of people are sort of trying to read their own hopes, their own understanding of Roman Catholicism into him, but it's still too early to tell. I don't know that he's tipped enough of his cards to indicate where he comes down.
This is all unknown. I want to just finish as we're running out of time here, but I want to finish by asking about some potential or future challenges that you perhaps see with American Catholicism and its identity and its expression within the American Republic. I mean, we are seeing a rise in the idea of post liberalism, um, of common good constitutionalism, of this idea that in many ways church and state relations should be more akin to pre-Vatican II than post-Vatican II. Do you see this as I know it's on the fringes of American Catholicism. Do you see this as something that's going to become increasingly in the spotlight going forward or not?
The thought that comes to mind immediately thinking about that is JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States. I was I was at the old State House in Boston yesterday, and they have a great, exhibit on the Tea Party riots and then other riots that have been in American history. At the end of it, they have a chalkboard where people can write things on the chalkboard, and there was somebody had written "No Kings," but somebody had also written "Vance 2028." Um, and as somebody who is a convert to Roman Catholicism, someone who is in an kind of odd place in American conservatism, um, and I'm a conservative as well, and I can appreciate some of that, but I think some of it is also odd, at least from the perspective of a Reaganite conservatism or something. Um, and I know Vance has hung out with some of the post-liberal um, Roman Catholic intellectuals, so-called integralists. So, I mean, that could be the future in a way. If he runs in 2028 and he wins, or even if he doesn't win, I mean, he still could be a force in American politics. That could be the future of at least that strain of Roman Catholicism. Now, he has a lot of critics inside the Roman Catholic Church. It's a very broad communion. Um, and it's hard for me to judge who has the upper hand in all that. I'm an outsider. Um, and I guess in the Francis years, maybe some of the progressive popes, bishops seem to have more of a say in the conference of bishops, perhaps. But again, that's an outsider's view of it. So that could be another indication of how the bishops themselves relate. One of the things that I did, I think, uh, reflect on, it's in some ways of the book I wrote about Catholicism, is that the intellectuals at Roman Catholic universities and elsewhere, who are some of the most thoughtful, careful thinkers that I've encountered, even someone like Ross Douthat, columnist at the New York Times, I consider like the smartest Christian out there writing about American society and developments. I constantly learn from him, but the bishops seem not to have as much standing, as much of a following in the church as some of these intellectuals do. And that's a kind of odd position for a church that's really built upon episcopacy and the bishops and the successors to the apostles. And I don't know that the Roman Catholic Church has yet figured that one out. They've just kind of let the intellectuals go and do their thing. And if you're a bishop and you do some weird things, you can get whacked. But the laity seem to have a fairly free hand. And I think that's a good thing. It's been good for America to have those intellectuals speaking and writing. What it does to the church, though, is another matter.
It strikes me just kind of summing up. Um, I have perceived for some time that within the broader Christian nationalist sort of movement, um, the Catholic intellectuals are supplying the intellectual heft, where Protestantism largely provides kind of the emotional drive, um, and the sort of reliance on the Holy Spirit and prophecy and the apostles and all of that. But it's a very different. They each contribute uniquely to this kind of project. But I've observed for a very long time that really the intellectual heft is carried by Roman Catholics.
Yeah.
Before we close, Al Smith was the Catholic
Thank you. Thank you.
presidential candidate.
Yeah.
I had to look that one up for sure. And no,
It's
this has
such
been
an
a
easy name. How could I forget it?
well, I knew it too, and I couldn't pull it out of my brain either, so I had to look it up.
The only thing I would add to that, what you say about um, Roman Catholic intellectual life, and I guess this is something also to keep an eye on going forward. It's the classical education, classical schools phenomenon, whether through the charter school area or through just private schools, and many of them are Christian. Hillsdale College has a program in classical education, master's level, and we have a charter school initiative there as well. And I'm not trying to shill for the college. It's just that this is a phenomenon that really wasn't very big, say 20 years ago, and it's become bigger. I don't know how big it is. I think it's hard to quantify, but one of the leaders of that movement, of all people, is this pastor in Moscow, Idaho, Doug Wilson, who is also his press published the Protestant version of an integralism called "The Case for Christian Nationalism" by Stephen Wolfe. I mean, I think in intellectual circles, Wilson and Wolfe, and I'm not a fan of either of them, but I will give them at least acknowledgement here. In intellectual circles, they're not really well regarded because Roman Catholics are at universities, have their PhDs, although Wolfe has a PhD. I mean, one of the prominent integralists, Roman Catholic background, Adrian Vermeule, who teaches constitutional law at Harvard. I mean, you can't get much more mainstream than that. So, but still, on the Protestant side, the intellectual life could be in this classical education movement, and I don't know where that's going to go either. And that does attract both Roman Catholics and Protestants, and more.
Darryl, this has just been a fascinating conversation. We could continue on and on, Alan. I mean, this could be our first hour-long podcast, but we better not go there.
You better not. My battery's running out.
Well, I do see a part 2 in our future down
I'd
the
love
track.
that. That would be great.
We've just enjoyed so much chatting with you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your academic insights into what is an ongoing issue in American society.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to write the article. It was a lot of fun, and this conversation was also great.
So thank you so much for joining us again for Just Liberty. Until next time, I'm Bettina Krause with Alan Reinach. And remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty.